The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine runway as Dr. Sarah Bennett's black Tesla Model X pulled up to the private aviation terminal. At 38 years old, she had already achieved what many would consider a lifetime of success, but today was special. Her hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as she thought about the keynote speech she would deliver in just 6 hours at the National Healthcare Innovation Summit in Chicago. Sarah checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting the collar of her navy blue blazer. Her dark curly hair was pulled back neatly in a professional bun, and the pearl earrings her grandmother had given her at medical school graduation caught the early morning light. 10 years ago, she would have never imagined herself here, about to board a private jet. Back then, she was just another talented neurosurgeon, working endless hours in the operating room. Everything had changed when she noticed a problem with the hospital's medical imaging system. Instead of just complaining about it, Sarah had spent her rare free time developing better software. What started as a simple solution had grown into Neurotech Solutions, now a company worth over $200 million. She had traded her surgical scrubs for business suits, and her schedule had become even more demanding than her days in the OR. The security guard at the terminal gate nodded respectfully as her car passed through. Sarah smiled, remembering how James, a morning guard, had been there since her first private flight 2 years ago. He had watched her company grow from a small startup to an industry leader. "Big day today, Dr. Bennett," he called out as she passed. "Chicago's waiting for you." Sarah gathered her things. A small carry-on suitcase containing her presentation outfit, her laptop bag with the speech she had perfected over the last month, and her favorite leather portfolio, a gift from her team after their first major contract. The portfolio contained the notes for the breakthrough announcement she would make today. Their imaging software had just received FDA approval for use in pediatric cases. The click of her low heels echoed through the terminal as she walked toward the security checkpoint. Around her, the private aviation terminal buzzed with its usual quiet efficiency. A few other early morning travelers, mostly older men in expensive suits, were scattered throughout the waiting area. Some were absorbed in their phones, while others sipped coffee from premium paper cups. The familiar scent of fresh coffee and leather seats filled the air. Sarah had learned to appreciate these small luxuries, though she never took them for granted. She remembered the days of running through crowded commercial airports, barely making connections between surgeries and meetings. Private travel wasn't just a luxury for her now. It was a necessity that allowed her to maintain the punishing schedule required to run her company while still having time to visit her parents in Atlanta every other weekend. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, her chief operating officer. "Team's ready for the Chicago announcement. Break a leg, boss." Sarah smiled, thinking of the office celebration they had planned for after the conference. Her success had never been just about her. It was about the brilliant team she had built, the patients their software had helped, and the changes they were making in medical technology. As she approached the security checkpoint, Sarah mentally reviewed her schedule. After the keynote in Chicago, she had investor meetings, then a quick flight to Boston for a hospital implementation review, and finally back to Atlanta by Friday for her niece's dance recital. The private jet waiting outside would make this hectic schedule possible. What Sarah didn't know as she walked toward the security checkpoint was that the next few minutes would change not just her day, but the entire private aviation industry. The regular security officer was out sick, and his replacement, Michael Wheeler, was about to make a decision that would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Sarah Bennett was about to face a challenge that would test not just her patience, but her ability to transform a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for lasting change. Michael Wheeler stood at the security checkpoint, his newly pressed uniform still stiff around the collar. It was only his third week working at the private aviation terminal, and he already had strong opinions about who belonged here and who didn't. He watched as Sarah Bennett approached, her credentials hanging from a lanyard around her neck, and immediately frowned. "Excuse me, miss," Wheeler called out, stepping directly into her path. "This is a private aviation terminal." His voice carried across the quiet space, causing several heads to turn. "I think you might be lost. The main terminal is about 2 miles down the road." Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her professional composure. She'd faced subtle discrimination before. This was different. "Good morning," she said clearly, holding up her credentials. "I'm Dr. Sarah Bennett, CEO of Neurotech Solutions. I have a scheduled flight this morning." Wheeler barely glanced at her credentials. Right, he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. And I'm the President of the United States. A few nervous laughs came from nearby, quickly silenced by the tension in the air. Do you have any idea how expensive private flights are? Sarah's hand tightened slightly on her leather portfolio, but her voice remained steady. Yes, I do. My company pays for them regularly. Would you like to see my flight documentation? She reached for her phone to pull up the flight details. Look, Wheeler said, crossing his arms. I've worked in security for 20 years. I know when something doesn't add up. Why don't you just save us both some time and... Is there a problem here? A young security trainee, Amy Chen, stepped forward from her observation post. She had been watching the interaction with growing concern, her hands fidgeting with her badge. Stay out of this, trainee, Wheeler snapped. I'm handling it. He turned back to Sarah. Maybe you're confused. Are you perhaps the assistant to someone flying today? Sarah pulled out her phone and opened her company's website, where her photo was prominently displayed on the leadership page. Mr. Wheeler, she said, reading his name tag, I understand you're doing your job, but your assumptions are incorrect and, frankly, discriminatory. Other travelers had stopped pretending to mind their own business. An older gentleman in a gray suit stepped closer, recognition dawning on his face. Dr. Bennett, I attended your medical technology presentation in Boston last month. Brilliant work on the neural imaging systems. Wheeler's face reddened, but he stood his ground. Anyone can make a fake website. I need to see additional identification. He emphasized each word as if speaking to a child. Multiple forms, and proof of your flight details, and maybe a letter from the jet company confirming your booking. Sarah had already pulled out her passport, pilot's license, she'd earned it 2 years ago, company ID, and flight documentation. Here's everything you've asked for, plus more. I'd also like to speak with your supervisor. The terminal had grown eerily quiet, even the coffee machine's hum seemed muted. Amy Chen had pulled out her phone, subtly recording the interaction. She knew what she was witnessing wasn't right. Well, Wheeler said, flipping through the documents with exaggerated slowness, these could all be very clever forgeries. Do you know how many people tried to sneak into private terminals? Sarah took another steady breath. In the operating room, she had learned that staying calm in tense situations was crucial. This was no different. Mr. Wheeler, every document you're holding is valid. Your job is to verify them, not to make assumptions about who can afford private travel. Wheeler's face grew darker. Listen here. No, you listen, Sarah interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. Every minute you delay me based on your prejudices is a minute that's being recorded, documented, and will be reported. I'm happy to stand here all day if necessary, but I suggest you do your actual job and verify my credentials properly. The morning sun through the terminal windows cast strange shadows across the scene. Wheeler's rigid stance, Sarah's composed determination, Amy's concerned expression, and the ring of onlookers who had become unwitting witnesses to this display of discrimination. None of them knew it yet, but this moment would soon become a turning point in private aviation security protocols across the country. The terminal's air conditioning hummed softly as Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the camera app. Mr. Wheeler, she said calmly, I'm going to record our interaction from this point forward. Her surgeon's hands were steady as she held the phone, just as they had been during countless delicate operations. Wheeler's face twisted into a scowl. Recording isn't allowed in secure areas, he said, taking a step toward her. But Sarah stood her ground, remembering all the times in medical school when people had doubted her abilities. Actually, Amy Chen spoke up again, her voice stronger now. There's no such policy against recording in the public areas of the terminal. She moved closer to Sarah, her trainee badge catching the morning light. I can confirm that as part of my recent security training. Sarah nodded gratefully at Amy. Thank you. She turned back to Wheeler, speaking clearly for the recording. It's now 7:15 a.m. I provided my passport, pilot's license, company ID, and flight documentation. Mr. Wheeler has refused to process them properly and has made several discriminatory comments. Other travelers had formed a loose circle around the scene. Among them was David Martinez, a regular at the terminal who recognized Sarah from previous flights. He stepped forward, addressing Wheeler. I've seen Dr. Bennett here at least a dozen times. She's a frequent flyer. Wheeler's face reddened further. "Stay out of this, sir. This is a security matter." He turned back to Sarah, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "Anyone can have fancy ID cards made these days. How do I know you're really a doctor?" Sarah opened her laptop bag and pulled out a medical journal. Her face was on the cover, next to the headline, "Neurotech Solutions Revolutionizes Brain Surgery Imaging." She placed it on the counter next to her other documents. "That's an interesting prop." Wheeler sneered, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Behind him, Amy was typing something into her phone, her young face set with determination. Sarah kept her phone steady, recording everything. "Mr. Wheeler, I'd like you to state clearly why you're refusing to verify my credentials. Is there something specific about them that seems incorrect, or are you basing your suspicion on other factors?" The question hung in the air like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and sharp. Several onlookers nodded in approval at her tactical approach. Wheeler shifted uncomfortably, aware that his next words could be crucial. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Marcus, her COO. "Everything okay? Flight crew called. They're waiting." She checked the time, 7:25 a.m. Her keynote speech in Chicago was scheduled for 2 p.m. "I have a flight crew and medical conference waiting," Sarah said, her voice remaining professional but firm. "Every minute you delay me here costs my company money and could impact patient care. I'm going to call terminal management now, but I want to give you one more chance to process my credentials properly." Emmy stepped forward again. "I can verify the credentials, sir. I completed the document verification training last week." Her offer hung in the air like a lifeline, but Wheeler ignored it. Instead, he pushed Sarah's documents back across the counter. "I'm going to need to speak with my supervisor before letting you through. You can wait over there." He pointed to a row of chairs near the wall. Sarah didn't move. "I'll wait right here, thank you." She pressed a few buttons on her phone, putting it on speaker. The terminal's main office number was already dialing. As the phone rang, Sarah noticed something interesting. The other travelers weren't just watching anymore. They were pulling out their own phones, recording the scene from different angles. A silver-haired woman in a business suit was shaking her head and typing rapidly on her tablet. A young man in tech company clothing had a determined look as he seemed to be live-tweeting the entire incident. What had started as one woman's encounter with discrimination was quickly becoming something bigger. Through the terminal's glass walls, the morning sun continued to rise, promising a day that would be memorable for reasons nobody had expected. Sarah Bennett had walked into the terminal planning to change the future of medical imaging. Now she was about to change something else entirely. The phone speaker crackled to life in the tense terminal air. "This is Robert Anderson, Terminal Operations Manager," a deep voice announced. The silver-haired man's voice carried authority even through the phone's small speaker. "Mr. Anderson," Sarah spoke clearly, maintaining her composure. "This is Dr. Sarah Bennett of Neurotech Solutions. I'm at your security checkpoint with an urgent situation." She could feel Wheeler shifting uncomfortably beside her as she continued. "I've been detained here for 20 minutes despite providing complete documentation for my scheduled flight." There was a brief pause before Anderson responded. "Dr. Bennett, I know you well. You fly with us twice a week." His voice sharpened. "What seems to be the problem?" Before Sarah could respond, the terminal's glass doors swished open. Robert Anderson himself strode in, phone still to his ear, his face concerned. He was a tall man in his 50s, dressed in a crisp dark suit, and he'd been managing the terminal for over 15 years. "I apologize for coming down personally," Anderson said, ending the call as he approached. "But when I saw who was being held up, I knew something wasn't right." He looked around at the gathered crowd, the recording phones, and Wheeler's red face. "Michael, what's going on here?" Wheeler straightened his uniform. "Sir, I was just following proper security protocols. The documentation needed extra verification and—" "Extra verification?" Anderson interrupted, picking up Sarah's credentials from the counter. "I've personally verified Dr. Bennett's credentials dozens of times. She's one of our most frequent flyers." He turned to Sarah. "Doctor, I deeply apologize for this incident. Please, let me escort you to your aircraft personally." But Sarah didn't move. Instead, she turned to face both Anderson and Wheeler. "Mr. Anderson, thank you for coming so quickly. However, I think we need to discuss something more important than my delayed flight. Amy Chen, the young trainee, stepped forward. Sir, she addressed Anderson, I recorded the entire interaction. The way Mr. Wheeler treated Dr. Bennett. She paused, gathering courage. It wasn't right, and it wasn't about security protocols. Anderson's expression grew more serious as he looked at the gathered witnesses. The silver-haired woman in the business suit stepped forward. I'm Margaret Chen, no relation to Amy, she said, holding up her phone. I'm on the board of Civil Aviation Rights, and I just sent our legal team the video of this entire incident. Wheeler's face had lost its redness, replaced by a growing paleness. I was just doing my job, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah raised her hand slightly, drawing everyone's attention. The same steady hand that had performed countless brain surgeries now commanded the room. Mr. Anderson, I don't want Mr. Wheeler fired. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. What I want, she continued, is something more meaningful. I want to talk about implementing a comprehensive anti-bias training program for all security personnel. My company specializes in creating advanced technical solutions, but we also understand the importance of human elements in any system. Anderson nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Dr. Bennett, would you be willing to help us develop such a program? Actually, Margaret Chen interrupted. The Civil Aviation Rights Board would be very interested in collaborating on such an initiative. We've been looking for a way to address these exact issues across private aviation. Sarah looked at her watch, 7:45 a.m. Her flight was now seriously delayed, but something more important was taking shape. She turned to Amy Chen, whose brave interruption had helped change the situation's direction. Would you be willing to share your perspective as a trainee? What you did today shows exactly the kind of awareness we need to build. The morning sun now filled the terminal completely, touching everyone in the scene. Sarah with her quiet determination, Anderson with his concerned professionalism, Amy with her growing confidence, Wheeler with his dawning realization, and the crowd of witnesses who had become part of something bigger than a simple security check. Sarah's phone buzzed again, another message about her delayed keynote speech in Chicago. But sometimes, she realized, the most important presentations happen in unexpected places, and the most valuable changes come from difficult moments. By noon that same day, Sarah's morning encounter at the airport had spread across social media like wildfire. She sat in her rescheduled private jet, watching the incident transform from a personal experience into a national conversation. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since she finally boarded. Dr. Bennett, her assistant's voice came through the speaker. CNN wants an interview. So does the morning show. And your video has over 2 million views already. The young assistant paused. Oh, and Marcus says your speech in Chicago has been pushed to tomorrow morning. The conference organizers were very understanding. Sarah looked out the plane window at the clouds below. The morning's events played over in her mind. Wheeler's discrimination, Amy's brave intervention, Anderson's quick response, and Margaret Chen's unexpected support. But what caught her attention most was the flood of messages from other people sharing similar stories. Sandra, Sarah spoke to her assistant. I want you to set up a meeting. Not with the TV shows, not yet. Get me a conference call with our marketing team, Margaret from Civil Aviation Rights, and Mr. Anderson from the terminal. Also, see if Amy Chen can join. The jet's leather seat creaked as Sarah leaned forward to check her laptop. Her email inbox was overflowing with messages from other business travelers, particularly women and minorities, sharing their own experiences with discrimination in private aviation. One email caught her eye. It was from Dr. James Carter, a prominent black cardiologist from Houston. Dr. Bennett, what happened to you this morning happened to me last month in Dallas, but I didn't have the courage to record it. Thank you for standing up. How can I help? Sarah's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard as she typed replies. She wasn't just responding to emails. She was building a coalition. Each message represented another voice, another story, another potential ally in creating real change. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Amy Chen. Dr. Bennett, other trainees are reaching out. We want to help with the training program. We see these things happen but often feel powerless to stop them. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, making Sarah's coffee cup rattle. It reminded her of how quickly things could get shaken up. and how important it was to stay steady through the chaos. A notification popped up on her laptop. Someone had started a hashtag. Hashtag Change the Narrative. Under it, thousands of people were sharing their own stories of facing discrimination in various spaces they were told they didn't belong in. The morning's incident was becoming a movement. Dr. Bennett, her assistant's voice returned. The terminal's parent company just issued a statement. They're launching a full investigation and want to work with you on new training protocols. And Mr. Wheeler has issued an apology. Sarah opened Wheeler's statement. His words seemed genuine. I was wrong. My actions this morning came from biases I didn't even realize I had. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. Looking at her watch, Sarah realized only 5 hours had passed since the incident. In that time, what could have been just another story of discrimination had transformed into something potentially revolutionary for the private aviation industry. Her phone lit up with a message from Margaret Chen. Sarah, the Civil Aviation Rights Board is meeting tomorrow. We want to turn this incident into industry-wide change. Private aviation has been an exclusive club for too long. Will you help us open the doors? The jet began its descent into Chicago. Sarah thought about all the surgeries she performed, all the lives she'd helped save through her medical technology. Now she had a chance to heal something else, a system that needed fixing. Sandra, she called to her assistant. Tell the conference organizers I want to make some changes to tomorrow's keynote. The future of medical imaging is still important, but right now we have a chance to change more than just technology. We can change minds. As the plane descended through the clouds, Sarah began outlining a new presentation. Sometimes the most important speeches weren't the ones you planned, but the ones that life suddenly made necessary. 2 weeks after the incident, Sarah sat at the head of a large conference table in her company's main office. Around her sat an unlikely group of allies. Robert Anderson from the terminal, Margaret Chen from Civil Aviation Rights, Amy Chen, the former trainee, now promoted to training coordinator, 3 aviation industry executives, and surprisingly, Michael Wheeler himself. The numbers are clear, Sarah said, pointing to the screen behind her. In the past 2 weeks, we've received over 5,000 reports of similar incidents across private aviation terminals nationwide. She clicked to the next slide, showing a map dotted with red markers. Each dot represents a verified story of discrimination. Wheeler shifted uncomfortably in his seat but raised his hand to speak. Since the incident, he had shown genuine remorse and a desire to change. Dr. Bennett, if I may. Sarah nodded, and he stood up. As someone who was part of the problem, I think I can help be part of the solution. These bias patterns, they're deep, but they can be changed if we're willing to face them. Amy Chen opened her laptop and shared her screen. I've been working with our team to develop a new training program, she said confidently. We're calling it Open Skies Initiative. It's not just about avoiding discrimination. It's about creating a truly inclusive environment in private aviation. The program outline appeared on the main screen: comprehensive bias training, regular sensitivity workshops, clear reporting procedures, and most importantly, a mentorship system pairing experienced staff with new trainees from diverse backgrounds. The key, Margaret Chen added, is making this standard across the industry. She pulled out a folder of documents. We've already got commitments from 12 major private aviation companies to implement these changes. They see this as not just the right thing to do, but as good business practice. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy airport runway in the distance. But training isn't enough, she said, turning back to the group. We need to change the face of private aviation itself. She clicked to a new slide showing statistics about private aviation employment. That's why we're launching the Aviation Equality Scholarship, Robert Anderson announced. Our terminal's parent company has committed $10 million to train and hire more diverse candidates in all positions, from security to management. Wheeler raised his hand again. I'd like to be one of the first trainers, he said quietly. My story, my mistake, can help others recognize their own biases. The room fell silent, considering the journey this man had made from being the face of discrimination to becoming an advocate for change. Sarah's assistant knocked and entered the room with a tablet. Dr. Bennett, we just got confirmation. The Federal Aviation Administration wants to use our training program as a model for all private aviation facilities in the country. The energy in the room shifted. What had started as one woman's encounter with discrimination was now becoming federal policy. Sarah looked around the table at the unlikely allies who had come together. Wheeler learning to confront his biases, Amy Chen finding her voice and leadership potential, industry executives realizing that inclusion was good business. "There's one more thing," Margaret Chen said, standing up. "The Civil Aviation Rights Board has created a new position, Chief of Aviation Equality Standards. Dr. Bennett, we'd like you to chair the committee that develops these standards." Sarah looked at her calendar on the wall. Between running her medical technology company, performing occasional surgeries to stay current, and now this new aviation initiative, her schedule would be incredibly full. But some opportunities were too important to pass up. "Before I accept," Sarah said, "I want to make sure we're clear about our goals. This isn't just about preventing discrimination. It's about creating a new normal in private aviation." She pointed to the map of reported incidents. "Every red dot on this map represents someone who faced what I faced. Our job is to make sure their stories become part of aviation history, not its future." The afternoon sun streamed through the office windows, highlighting the determination on every face around the table. They weren't just discussing change anymore, they were creating it. 6 months after the incident, Sarah's heels clicked against the familiar floor of the private aviation terminal. This time, everything felt different. The morning sun streamed through the windows just like that fateful day, but the space itself had transformed. New signs adorned the walls. "Welcome to all" in multiple languages. The security desk now had a diverse team of officers, and behind the main counter stood Michael Wheeler, wearing a new badge that read Diversity Training Coordinator. "Good morning, Dr. Bennett," Wheeler called out, his voice carrying a warmth that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. He was leading a training session for new security officers, using his own story as a teaching tool. "Would you mind if my trainees observe your security check? We're demonstrating the new protocols." Sarah smiled and nodded. Of course. She watched as Wheeler turned to his group of trainees, who represented a rainbow of backgrounds and experiences. Among them was a young black woman who reminded Sarah of herself 15 years ago. "Watch carefully," Wheeler said to his trainees. "6 months ago, I stood right here and made every mistake possible. Today, we're going to demonstrate how to do it right." He turned back to Sarah. "Dr. Bennett, may I see your credentials, please?" The security check proceeded smoothly, professionally, and respectfully. Wheeler explained each step to his trainees, pointing out the proper way to verify documents without making assumptions. The young black trainee took detailed notes, her eyes bright with attention. Amy Chen, now the terminal's head of security training, approached with a tablet in hand. "Dr. Bennett, I thought you'd like to see the latest numbers," she said proudly. "We've processed over 50,000 passengers since implementing the new protocols. Zero discrimination complaints, and our customer satisfaction ratings are up 87%. Sarah looked around the terminal. The changes weren't just in policies and procedures. They were visible in the faces of both staff and travelers. A Muslim woman in a hijab passed through security without a second glance. An elderly Asian couple was being assisted respectfully by a young security officer. A black executive in a wheelchair was being efficiently helped through the checkpoint. "Dr. Bennett," Wheeler called out again as she collected her belongings. "Would you mind telling the trainees about that day? They've heard my side, but I think they need to hear yours too." Sarah looked at the eager faces of the trainees and set down her bag. Some stories needed to be told, especially when they could shape future actions. 6 months ago, she began, I walked into this terminal as a CEO and walked out as an advocate for change. The trainees gathered around as Sarah shared her experience. She noticed the young black trainee leaning forward, hanging on every word. After she finished, the trainee raised her hand. "Dr. Bennett, what made you decide to turn that moment into a movement instead of just filing a complaint?" Sarah thought carefully before answering, because filing a complaint would have helped only me. But creating change helps everyone who comes after me. She gestured around the terminal. "Look at this space now. It's not just about avoiding discrimination. It's about creating true belonging." Wheeler stepped forward, his face serious, and sometimes, he added, the people who need to change the most are the ones who don't even realize they need to change. He touched his new badge. "I'm living proof that transformation is possible." As Sarah finally headed toward her gate, She passed a wall that hadn't been there 6 months ago. It was called the Wall of Change, covered with photographs and stories of aviation pioneers from all backgrounds. In the center was a plaque that read, "Every journey begins with welcome. Every welcome begins with respect." Her phone buzzed. A message from Margaret Chen. "Sarah, the Federal Aviation Administration just approved our training program for nationwide implementation. Your incident was the spark, but look at the fire of change it started." Sarah paused at her gate, watching the diverse stream of travelers and staff moving efficiently through the terminal. 6 months ago, she had faced discrimination in this very space. Now, that space had become a model for inclusive aviation practices across the country. As she boarded her flight, Sarah smiled at a final addition to the terminal, a small sign near the security desk that read, "Change the narrative. Change the world. One flight at a time." 1 year after the incident, Sarah stood on a different stage, this time at the National Aviation Security Conference in Washington, D.C. The huge convention center was packed with aviation professionals from across the country. In the front row sat familiar faces: Michael Wheeler, Amy Chen, Margaret Chen, and Robert Anderson. "A year ago," Sarah began, her voice carrying through the massive hall, "I was just a CEO trying to catch a flight. Today, I stand before you as part of something much bigger." Behind her, the screen showed statistics that told a powerful story. Over 500 private aviation terminals had adopted their training program, complaints of discrimination had dropped by 75%, and employee satisfaction had risen across the industry. In the audience, Wheeler nodded along. He had become one of the most requested speakers at aviation security events, sharing his story of transformation. His honest accounts of confronting and overcoming his own biases had helped countless others recognize and change their prejudiced behaviors. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," Sarah continued, clicking to the next slide. Images appeared of diverse travelers and aviation staff, each picture telling its own story of change. "These are the real measures of our success, the people who no longer have to prove they belong." Amy Chen, now a national training coordinator, stood up to join Sarah on stage. "When I was a trainee watching Dr. Bennett face discrimination, I had a choice," she told the audience. "Stay quiet or speak up." Today, we're training security officers not just to avoid discrimination, but to actively stand against it. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. Another message from her medical technology company. Neurotech Solutions had grown even more successful over the past year, partly because her handling of the airport incident had shown her leadership abilities in a new light. But today wasn't about medical technology. "The Open Skies Initiative isn't just a training program anymore," Sarah announced. "It's becoming the new standard in aviation security." She gestured to a group of international aviation officials in the audience. "Next month, we begin implementing these protocols in major airports across Europe and Asia." Wheeler raised his hand during the question period. "Dr. Bennett," he said, standing up, "a year ago, I was the face of discrimination in private aviation. Today, I'm helping train the next generation of security officers. What would you say to others who might be resistant to change?" Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "Change isn't just about policies and procedures," she said. "It's about people. Every person who walks through our terminals has a story, has dignity, has a right to respect. Our job isn't just to check credentials, it's to check our own biases." After the presentation, Sarah walked through the conference hall. Young security officers stopped to shake her hand. Aviation executives wanted to discuss implementing the program at their facilities. But what touched her most was a group of diverse aviation students who approached her with tears in their eyes. "Dr. Bennett," one young woman said, "because of your story, we know we can succeed in this industry. You showed us that one person really can change the system." That evening, Sarah returned to the same terminal where everything had started. The Wall of Change had grown, now featuring hundreds of photographs and stories. A documentary crew was filming a piece about the transformation in aviation security. Amy Chen was giving a tour to new international partners. As Sarah went through security, she smiled at the new sign above the checkpoint: "Security with dignity. Everyone's right, everyone's responsibility." The young officer checking her credentials was professional, respectful, and efficient, exactly as it should have been a year ago. Her phone lit up with a final message of the day. It was from a major airline CEO. Dr. Bennett, your private aviation initiative has inspired us. Would you help us implement similar changes across commercial aviation? There are millions of passengers who could benefit from what you've started. Sarah looked out the terminal windows at the setting sun. 1 year ago, she had faced discrimination in this very spot. Now, that moment of prejudice had transformed into a movement of change, spreading far beyond one terminal, one incident, or one person. As she boarded her flight, Sarah thought about how sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes, if you'd have the courage to change the narrative.